So I'll turn now to the expert panel and see who wants to kick off the discussion. Anyone offering to make some opening comments and remarks? I'll call on Dr. Pachauri first.
Well, I must say the audience has been profound, and I was particularly happy to see the response to the first set of issues that were raised, because it's entirely correct. There is no silver bullet in dealing with this problem. In order to bring about an improvement in agriculture, both in terms of yields and productivity, but also in respect of reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, we need a whole range of initiatives that are going to make agriculture far more responsible. And here we must accept the fact that we are dealing with a globe where there are enormous disparities. It's not just enough to produce food in the aggregate, and I think the point was put across when it was said that there's enough for everyone. The problem is one of distribution. But we must realize that the impacts of climate change on some of the poorest agricultural workers, landowners, is going to be particularly serious. And I want to mention one particular number which would be of some significance in this regard. In Africa, we have projected in the fourth assessment report of the IPCC that as early as 2020, there are some countries that would see a decline in agricultural yields of up to 50% on account of climate change and climate variability. Now, these are farmers who are not selling to the market. The bulk of them are producing essentially to feed themselves and their families. A study in Kenya, for instance, has found that there are only 36% of the farmers who are actually selling their produce, and 20% of them account for the bulk of what is being sold. So in other words, the large majority of farmers in that country, as is the case in many other parts of Africa, are producing food only for themselves. And therefore, if we produce more in any other part of the world, we'll also have to ensure that people who are the poorest inhabitants of this planet have enough income, enough resources to be able to buy that food from the global market. So the point I'd like to make is you really need a whole range of inputs to bring about improvements in agriculture. And here, may I say, one absolutely vital input is going to be affected by the impacts of climate change. And let me just give you two examples. Firstly, in most of the mountain areas, we know that in general, the glaciers are melting very rapidly. Now, when that happens, it has major implications downstream. There's a large number of farmers who are dependent on water supply, which is the result of snow melt, ice melt from the glaciers. They are going to be affected, generally in an adverse direction. The other point I'd like to make is we already have a planet which is water stressed. And here, may I give you the example of Africa, and then I'll stop. We have projected that by 2020, we would have about 75 to 250 million people in Africa living in a state of water stress. So here is a vital input which is required for agriculture, which is going to be affected by the impacts of climate change. So while, of course, we must adapt to these impacts, I think globally it is essential for us to see that we stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which requires very rapid reduction in emissions. And therefore, this is a global responsibility which covers every sector of the economy, including agriculture. So I'll stop here, and I hope I'll have an opportunity to say more on the subject later. Thank you.
Luis Fresco, you've written very directly about all of these issues. You're well known for your direct comments on them. Do you think that Oisin Coughlin was right when he said that the problem is not food production?
Well, I think this is the problem that we always have. Yes, there is a problem of distribution, definitely. But the areas where people are hungry are indeed areas of poverty, areas where income is not enough. But you can't solve that by producing food just anywhere. Most of the cereals that are the staple foods for people in poor countries have to be produced more or less locally. In fact, only 10 to 12% of the cereals come to the world market. That's the one side of the story. On the other hand, we know that from an ecological point of view, food has to be produced there where it can best be produced, under the most favorable circumstances, because if you don't do that, maintaining low productivity in poor countries often always means low yields and always means an environmental disaster. To be provocative, as I usually am, for those of you who don't know me, let me say that one of the most destructive ways of using the land is using tropical soils for annual crops with heavy rainfall and no fertilizer. That is a recipe for disaster. So what we need is intensification, and you cannot intensify everywhere. And I think the question was very seriously and very well put. Should Ireland or should Europe produce a surplus to feed the rest of the world? Yes, for some things we need to do it, but the devil is in the details. Yes, perhaps for some products that cannot be produced better elsewhere, and think of milk products, for example. That's a good example where Ireland and some other countries have a comparative advantage over many other countries in the world, and hence there, with the guarantees for food safety, that's probably a very good option. We cannot produce milk under the same favorable conditions in many parts of the world. But for cereals, I make an exception. I think the bulk of the rice should be produced in Asia, where the bulk of the eaters are. So intensification is a matter of location, it's a matter of smart solutions, and that's, by the way, why I like this comment from one of the children about insects so much. Because indeed, looking towards other sources of protein, and whether it's algae or insects or something else that can replace some of the animal proteins, is indeed the way forward. So apart from intensification, we definitely also need smart solutions, and we need research.
Okay, Marion Juliu, could I bring you in here, because you've obviously, from your experience as a public servant working with agriculture, we heard the comment made about sustainability and the sustainability of Irish farming there from Michael Barry. He was placing great emphasis from an Irish point of view on this. What does the science say? I mean, is that one of the key issues we need to be addressing?
Yes, of course. I mean, obviously, you know, all what the children that have said is quite interesting. I mean, they have common sense, if I may say so. In all their remarks, you see things that are very deep. And in fact, when you look at the situation, you know that with a small increase in the yields, for instance, of wheat, because the three cereals that Louise was mentioning, I mean, wheat, rice, and maize, are the basis of the food in the world. And of course, if you increase the yield, at the moment it's plus 1%, the increase in the yields. But now you know that climate change makes it difficult to increase quickly. I mean, there is a kind of plateau in the yields of the cereals because of climate change. So we need research so that we get a better increase. And in fact, 1.7% is enough to feed the world, if you look at projections of the population. So to increase from 1% to 1.7%, it supposes to adapt, for instance, the genetics of the cereals to the new conditions. So should it be the variability of the weather? How do you build resilience? Plants that accept changes, I mean heat shocks or heat waves, that resist to such dramatic situations. When you remember about the spring in UK, was it last year? When you remember about the Russia problem in 2010, when you remember about, well, you can take many examples in Europe in 2003, in Australia and so on. In many parts of the world, you had very big problems of non-adaptation of the crops to the new conditions of weather. And there you have to invent. You have to select breeds. You have to find in the world, in the diversity, the plants that are adapted to the new conditions. You have then to have more robust systems of for the plants or for the animals. And then, yes, you need a lot of innovations, because the conditions now are not the conditions that were in the previous years when we succeeded in what I should call the green revolution. Yes, we have to innovate a lot. So research is necessary for that, for monitoring, for innovation, for adaptation, for mitigation. Yes, I think we have very practical solution to propose to those children.
Well, Pam Ronald, I mean, you're obviously working in this field. Is science keeping up? Is it keeping pace with the requirements of agriculture? And is it able to address these complex interactions between farming and climate change with perhaps the new technologies and the new techniques, or do you think that science is lagging behind what we need as a population?
Well, I absolutely agree that research is very important, and as some of the speakers have said, technologies are not a silver bullet. However, improved technologies can have a tremendous impact on the lives of small farmers. And this is especially true in the face of global climate change. And I can give you an example of a project that I was fortunate to be involved in. So when we think of climate change, often we think of droughts and heat, but also there are changes in precipitation and increased flooding in some parts of the world. And this is especially a serious situation in Asia, South and Southeast Asia, where 25% of the world's rice is grown. And in those regions, every year there have been tremendous flooding, and in fact, the last few years, the flooding has increased. And this is very damaging for the rice crop because although rice does grow in water, if it's completely submerged for more than 3 days, the rice will die. And so many years ago, about 50 years ago, research geneticists identified an ancient variety of rice that was very tolerant of flooding. It was incredible. It could stay underwater for 2 weeks, and then when the floods subsided, it could survive. However, this variety was essentially not edible. And so working together, teams of geneticists and breeders were able to isolate the gene controlling this submergence tolerance and bring it into varieties that are favored by farmers in Bangladesh and India and other parts of the world. The International Rice Research Institute has released 5 or 6 varieties now carrying this gene for submergence called Sub-1. And it's having very tremendous effects where the yields are 3 to 5-fold in conditions of flooding, which are occurring every year. And these are farmers with very little money. They're living on less than $1 a day. So when they see this tremendous increase on yield on the same amount of land, it has a dramatic impact on those farmers' lives. Last year, 1 million farmers grew that rice. So these are simple technologies that can have a tremendous impact on the lives of farmers. And we're going to see a lot more of that. And just to give you an example of how fast paced genetic research is moving, is in the year 2000, we had the first sequence of a plant genome. It's a small little weed called Arabidopsis. Nobody eats it, but it's a model genome. It grows and the plant grows very quickly. It cost quite a bit of money. It took 7 years, something like $500,000, and many, many people worked on this project. The same project is expected to be completed next year in 2 to 3 minutes at a cost of $99. And now we not only have the Arabidopsis genome, we have the rice genome, the maize genome. People are working on the wheat genome. We have the tomato genome. And not only do we have a single genome, but we have genomes from many different varieties of plants. So geneticists can now go in to those genomes and fish out genes that have not been used before to try to develop plants that can adapt to climate change. So I think there are tremendous developments in research and tremendous opportunities, and certainly we need to invest in those technologies to bring about a sustainable intensification.
Okay, I'm going to go to Lynn Frewer in just a second, but we're getting lots of tweets in, very busy in the Twitter sphere. We've had a comment from Stephen Van Duin, who says that there is no food problem, there's a lack of will, it's a distribution problem, he maintains, and I think we might have a further discussion about that in a moment. We got a nice SMS message actually from Northern Ireland, somebody who was watching online who said they thought having the kids at the start was great, so thank you very much for that comment, we appreciate it. And we've also got a comment in from the apple farmer, a tweet. He's one of the farmers, or she maybe, no, it's a he, I believe, it's Cornelius Trass is his name. He says he's one of the, the farmers being audited against sustainability criteria. He says it's a good way to start, but way too simplistic, and much more is needed. I think later in the conversation we should definitely look at these policy options and how they should be implemented. But Lynn, I'm just a bit curious about this whole, we're talking a lot about the farmers, and yet the children seem to think personal responsibility and the consumer were just as important. I mean,
I'd actually like to pick up on the statement from, is it Oisin Coghlan? From Friends of the Earth. And you said there's no shortage of food globally. The problem is not production, it's distribution. And that was also the comment on the Twitter feed there. Now, certainly in developed countries, we know that between 30 and 40% of food that's taken into the household is wasted. If you look at the impact of that over the developed world, that's an enormous loss of calories. If you also factor in the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues in terms of the disease burden globally, particularly in European countries, developed countries, but also in the emerging economies, is related to overnutrition, obesity, getting too many calories. It's quite clear that there is a distribution problem. I'm not arguing that distribution alone will solve the problems of food security. More needs to be done. We have a growing population, we have shifts in consumption preferences. In the emerging economies, more people are looking to the social norm that's been established in the West for high meat consumption, which is why we're trying to produce more meat to feed those populations. One solution is to look at not only increasing food production, but also to change the kind of norms that we adopt in terms of food choice, how we treasure and nurture the food that we have, and also to pick up on some of the things that the other speakers have said, to ensure that food is grown close to the point of consumption, but that also doesn't interfere with the global economy in terms of destroying the cash crops that many developing countries are also dependent on. So I think the point I'd like to make is that this is not a unidisciplinary problem that can be solved using a quick technological fix. It requires cooperation between consumers, citizens, scientists, and the policy community to develop a way forward. And that involves talking to each other. I'm sure we'll come back to it later, but there are also cases where technology has been applied very successfully. I raised the issue, for example, of genetically modified rabbits, which have been used not in the context of food security, but to produce monoclonal antibodies to treat cancer. There's broad societal approval for this and broad consumer acceptance if we treat patients as the end consumer of that product. But other cases, the EnviroPig, a genetically modified pig in Canada that was bred to produce less phosphate in its feces and thereby improve the environment of the existing intense sustainable production system. There was no consumer demand for the product, there was no commercial trajectory, commercialization trajectory, and the last of those animals, I believe, was put down on the 22nd of June, so not very long ago.
China has taken up these animals, so it's
okay.
relevant.
That's an interesting development. In terms...
Sorry, Louise, could you repeat that? We hadn't got you on mic at the time.
Okay, I was just saying this same development and same research has been taken up or developed independently in part by China, where it is a success and where there is a demand. So the answer there is probably that the solutions, again, have to be tailor-made.
But I think that's exactly the case that I'm making. One unitary solution will not fit the kind of requirements of different communities and different cultures. Everybody has different preferences for engaging in a technology, using a technology in different ways. And I think that has to be recognized, perhaps, when we come to the policy discussion later on today.
Yeah, I think Marion wanted to come in there as well.
Yes, it was, does it work? Yes. It was just a short remark on the local production. I mean, obviously, yes, we need to think about local production, but sometimes the optimum is not local production. Even if you look at the environmental cycle, and I come back to the example of the milk that Louise gave previously, and sometimes if you need to heat to get tomatoes in a country, then it is better for the environment to ship the products from elsewhere. And I think that contrary to what we think naturally, we have to be careful that trade still exists in the food sector, because when there will be climatic problems, of course trade could be a way to balance the production, I mean a way to ensure, to secure the production. So yes, for local production, of course, because it's local development, but we have to be very careful not to say it's the universal solution as well.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I live in California's Central Valley, which produces half the fruits and vegetables and nuts in the entire United States. So it's easy for us to eat locally. My husband is a farmer, an organic farmer, so it's especially easy for me, but that's not the case of my friends in Wyoming in the winter. So if they're going to have a healthy eating style, they either need to work very hard to can and dry fruit, which few people do anymore, or they're going to be importing those fruits and vegetables from other parts of the world.